What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh, and I'm joined in the studio, as always, by my co-host, Austin. How's it going, man?
That's good. How about you?
Living the dream.
Nice.
We also got our producer, Danny. He's back this week. Feeling better?
I'm feeling way better, and I hope everybody out there is feeling good too.
Today, we're going to be covering probably one of the most highly requested topics that we've had in a long time, and that is going to be discussing an individual who worked for Nickelodeon for a number of years. And no, it's not Dan Schneider. This is a huge topic when talking about the recent docuseries that came out called Quiet on Set. And you could literally do either hours long episode.
If we did the whole shebang, it would be a 10-hour, 20-parter. It'd be crazy.
Yeah, it'd just be way too much. Plus, one of our other shows here at Mile High Media, The Sesh, my wife's podcast, they just did an episode kind of focusing more on Dan Schneider and the allegations around him, touching on some of the other things that happened in the docuseries. But today, we're going to be focusing really primarily on Brian Peck, Drake Bell, and a few others that are kind of in this ring.
Yeah. It goes forever, unfortunately, once you start connecting dots. I'm not a big tinfoil hat guy, but it is very obvious that Hollywood has a systemic issue here. And you find one guy, you'll find his friend, you'll find his friend, you'll find his friend. So we tried to keep a little bit of direction with this episode and mostly focusing on Brian Peck, but it's hard to not talk about other bad actors that are involved.
Absolutely. Well, for me personally, after watching the series, and one of the biggest things that just shocked me was obviously the things that Brian Peck did, but also this connection he had to John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah.
I was like, what? My jaw dropped out of my face.
Total creep. And it kind of all makes sense,
Yeah, it's just so disgusting when looking at this whole story as a whole. But we're really going to be diving deep into Brian Peck, where he started, where things are at now, as well as diving in a little bit deeper than the docuseries did around Drake Bell, the accusations against him, and kind of putting it all together, and obviously exploring the John Wayne Gacy connection a little bit, because it's just shocking it's really not that shocking when you consider all things, but
yeah. We'll also be getting into the letters as well, the letters of support, because it kind of opens up everyone's eyes to Hollywood and how everyone's obsessed with connections and supporting each other even through horrific things like this.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the way that Hollywood has operated is a breeding ground for predators. It's a breeding ground for people who are evil, quite frankly. And there's this there's this balance of power that those at the top have over anybody beneath them that you see sometimes in other industries. I think one of the things I think of is kind of that balance of power between, say, a YouTuber, an influencer, somebody who has a large following. And, we've seen some of those out there who make content on the internet who've had inappropriate relationships with their fans and things like that, because there's something about having all the power on one side, and if somebody underneath you tries to go against whatever you're doing, then there's only going to be a negative effect to those that are at the bottom as opposed to those at the top. And Hollywood has done an extremely good job at protecting those at the top. And those at the top have been in this industry for years and years and years. And so
it hinges upon this idea of also just taking advantage of people's desperation for stardom. People clearly will just put up with almost everything as long as they can maintain some status in Hollywood, and people will be quiet and people will do horrific things And it's all about like towing the line because of this disgusting power structure.
I feel like getting rid of that power structure is the only way to solve this systemic issue, especially of child predators running rampant through Hollywood.
I think law is also failing
Yeah.
here. Like, why are they not knowing that Hollywood and LA is like this, that literally like the biggest place for film in the entire world? It's crazy that they specifically don't have regulations and laws to protect children at this rate.
Yeah, and those that work, I mean, maybe it's because these networks have just gotten too large and they're not able to keep an eye on the producers and creators and those in the highest positions of power throughout the industry. But I highly doubt that. I think it's probably because it runs all the way to the top.
Yeah.
And so all the dominoes have to fall for this to ever get any better, it seems like. And there's just lots of denial and victim blaming going on.
Yep.
So it's
a mess.
I mean, Hollywood's an evil place.
It really is. And this is coming from someone who loves movies too. And it's hard for me to swallow this pill that it's like just an incredibly toxic, terrible place. And so I don't know, maybe this is all a good opportunity for us to go check out some indie movies, maybe non-Hollywood movies, and
totally
support that industry. That's where it seems to be a bit safer, because Hollywood just doesn't seem like the place that's harboring positive, creative energy out here. It's just seems like a dark place, really.
Certainly no place for children.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hardest parts for me, is there's so much nostalgia around these shows, and we grew up with these child actors, and to find out just how fucked up everything is, and all these horrific things that have happened to these child actors is it's so disappointing, and it just kills that nostalgia, and because it makes you think, you're like, oh my God, while they're making these shows, they were enduring this horrible abuse and being preyed upon by those that they worked for. And it's just,
yeah, you and I grew up with these shows, so that's why it hits a little bit harder too, because Drake and Josh, we were talking about it, it's like that was one of my favorite shows.
My favorite show.
And all that was also one of my favorite shows, and the Amanda Show was also like, this was my childhood right here. So yeah, it hits hard.
Yeah, I'm glad that it's coming out now. I think they did a really good job with the docuseries, and it's interesting how we're seeing more and more of these kind of docuseries come out, and people are finally speaking up and speaking out against these people who have been hiding in the shadows for so many years, and also bringing these crimes to the forefront, where, when Brian Peck did all this, did any of us know about it? No. And that's what's crazy, is it's just all kind of just swept under the rug. And, the PR teams that work for these guys just, they do a good job at hiding everything and just making sure it all goes away. But the fact that people feel comfortable enough to come forward and speak out now is, I think, the one positive from all of this.
Yeah. I still think this is kind of like whatever this is now, like a third, fourth wave of kind of the Me Too movement. It's still, I think that empowered a lot of people to come out. So it's cool that, it's still seeing a positive effect even to this day. Cause I think it caught wind back in like, what was it? Like 2016, 17, 18 was when it really took off. So it's been many years since then. And it's nice to see that it hasn't just died out. It's not a movement that died on the vine.
I mean, my hope is that by all of this happening and people speaking out and docuseries being made, that it deters future crimes from happening, and hopefully gives people the courage who maybe are currently experiencing whatever it may be, crimes against them, harassment, sexual abuse, whatever it may be, that they stand up and feel brave enough to come forward and put these criminals behind bars, because we need to, the Hollywood needs a cleansing. I mean, it is filthy. And I mean, I remember going to Hollywood, California for the first time a few years ago, and I was like, this is not.
Oh, Hollywood's gross.
Hollywood is grimy, man.
It's very weird.
It's not the glitz
There's
and
like
glam.
needles in the gutters and some dude dressed up as Spider-Man walking around. But yeah, I don't know. That's why it seems like in our minds it's this golden place. But in reality, it's just kind of a shitty place.
Yeah, it really is. Well, let's just go ahead and jump in, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning with Mr. Bryan Richard Peck, which, by the way, no relation to the actor Josh Peck, despite having the same last name.
Yeah, just a coincidence.
Bryan was born on July 29th, 1960 in Huntington, Indiana, and we did some digging to try to find any background info on his early life, and not a whole lot, unfortunately. No, a lot of that's not public, despite him being sort of a public figure. But Bryan got his start in the entertainment industry in the 80s, and his first big break was playing Scuzz in the comedy horror movie The Return of the Living Dead. And by the early 90s, he had become a dialogue and acting coach for many child actors in the industry. He worked on children's shows like Growing Pains, Boy Meets World, another one of my favorite shows, and The Amanda Show. He also played the character Pickle Boy on all that, and he worked with Shia LaBeouf in the Disney movie Holes, another good movie.
I love that movie. Love the book, too.
Yeah, great story. Besides his work in Hollywood, he was also known for having a very strange interest in the prolific serial killer John Wayne Gacy. And during the filming of all that, the child actor, Kyle Sullivan, was over at Bryan's house when he noticed a shrine to Planet of the Apes, but near the shrine was an odd painting of a clown holding balloons. And it turns out this was a painting John Wayne Gacy had signed and sent to Bryan Peck. And supposedly on the back it read, "To Bryan, I hope you enjoy the painting. Best wishes, your friend, John Wayne Gacy." Why on earth would that be something you'd want?
I don't know.
You want to be this guy's friend?
People do like fetishize serial killers, and it's so gross. And I mean, it's like interesting because Bryan Peck specifically is into this, but
a lot of people are into that.
Yeah, it's like, it's a strange cultural thing. I can't wrap my head around people's like obsession with them.
I think a lot of times they almost just, those people aren't plugged into reality anymore, and they've kind of romanticized and fantasized this character.
Yeah.
It almost is like so horrific that they're like, this isn't real.
Oh, that's a good point.
And they're kind of like this infamous villain from a movie or something.
Yeah.
Which is just mind blowing to me, because it's like, how do you let yourself get there? But I'm assuming that's kind of how they feel. They almost feel like they're this famous movie star.
Weird. And it's like, oh, here it's showing off his painting and stuff but I would equate that's like equal to like Nazi memorabilia or something. Like, it's the equivalent of that in a way where it's like, why would you even want to show that off? This is like disgusting material.
Yeah.
Get rid of it immediately. I don't know why this is a thing you have almost like a shrine to in his house.
The shrine thing is weird. And to be fair, Zach Bagans, I believe, has some John Wayne Gacy items, but for him,
different context.
Makes a little bit more sense because he has a lot of serial killer objects because that's his thing. And, he has a paranormal museum. So a little bit different. Like, I doubt I'd be surprised if Zach Bagans has a picture that John Wayne Gacy made next to his bed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or like in his house somewhere, just displayed. I mean, I don't know for sure. I've never been to his house, but I would highly doubt it, probably.
Yeah.
So obviously here on the show, we've covered John Wayne Gacy in the past, and you can go check that episode out. But if you're not familiar, in short, he tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in the 1970s, and then buried a majority of them beneath his house. And just a very sick, twisted individual, an absolute monster, and somebody Bryan Peck clearly is proud of knowing, which
And
It's
much
disturbing.
much like Brian Peck, he was seen in kind of his industry, his community, as like this upstanding guy. People liked him. I'm pretty sure it was John Wayne Gacy had a picture with like the first lady and stuff because he was kind of into politics. But he, in a similar way, just like Brian Peck, he had these kind of connections in his community and his industry.
Many years later, though, Brian Peck would become John Wayne Gacy's pen pal while he was on death row. And apparently, Brian was one of thousands. It's estimated that John Wayne Gacy had over 20,000 pen pals in prison. He sold paintings, which may or may not have been actually painted by him. He used that money to buy stamps and stationery to keep up with all those pen pals. He also had a 1-900 number in prison, so people could pay $2 a minute to hear a 12-minute recording of him claiming his innocence. Can't even get started on that. It's just
became his full-time job of doing stupid shit.
Letting
like
this guy profit in prison?
Right.
Like, how is that even a thing?
I think a lot of states now have laws to where you can't do this anymore. Probably for this exact
right.
because of John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, because the state actually tried to sue him in 1994 to repay the cost of his imprisonment because, like, dude, you're making all this money and we're paying for you to be here, basically.
Right.
It's estimated he made around $141,000 from his schemes in prison. The lawsuit was later dropped after his lawyer argued that John Wayne Gacy could not be executed while in a pending lawsuit. This would have to go through another appeal process, and that last appeal was denied on May 3rd, 1994, and John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10th in 94. Brian Peck's fascination with John Wayne Gacy might have been a sign that he had been hiding as a predator in plain sight during his entire career with Nickelodeon, and you almost wonder, especially once you find out what he does later on, where he may have gotten some inspiration for that. It's hard to deny that connection there.
Yeah. Before we dive into this, I just wanted to pull a quote. This is kind of personal for me because this was opened my eyes to everything. Good old Elijah Wood.
Bless him.
Yeah, bless this man.
A true legend.
I love Elijah Wood, but he's most famous for playing Frodo in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, which I know you and I are both really big fans of, right?
I'm a fanatic.
Yeah, yeah. And he had actually made some comments about pedophiles in the industry back in 2016. And this was kind of before, Me Too had gained widespread attention. People weren't really talking about things this explicitly in public, but it was really this quote that first opened my eyes to kind of this toxic power structure of Hollywood. This was 8 years ago, and here's what he had to say. Quote, "Clearly something major was going on in Hollywood. It was all organized. There are a lot of vipers in this industry, people who only have their own interests in mind. There is darkness in the underbelly. What bums me out about these situations is that the victims can't speak as loudly as the people in power. That's the tragedy of attempting to reveal what is happening to innocent people. They can be squashed, but their lives have been irreparably damaged. If you're innocent, you have very little knowledge of the world, and you want to succeed. People with parasitic interests will see you as their prey." And he later clarified this quote. He said he had never personally experienced or seen anything firsthand in the industry, and his opinions were heavily inspired by this documentary, which I've seen. It's called An Open Secret, which is the perfect title when you're talking about this. And it came out in 2014. I think you can actually watch it free on YouTube. I highly recommend checking this documentary out, but it focuses on exposing child abuse in California's film industry. And yeah, sure enough, that film also featured Brian Peck. At the time, obviously, they didn't know of Drake Bell's connection to everything,
right,
but he was mentioned in there.
That's really interesting. I think he said it perfectly. People with parasitic interests will see you as their prey.
Yep.
And that's exactly what's going on there. I only have a little personal experience from experiencing this a little bit, just going, Kendall and I have been out to LA a few times for potential opportunities when it comes to TV shows, documentaries, things like that. And we've met with producers who've worked on large projects before, actually. I believe, I'm trying to remember their names, but they worked on a number of different films. I want to say like Transformers possibly was one of them, and some action films, but they were interested in developing a show with Kendall. And I remember we had coffee with them and just I just had such a weird vibe. Not saying there was anything like nefarious necessarily, but just the parasitic thing.
Yeah.
I just felt like the entire time, they come across as like, oh, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you want to do. But then just the way that everything's explained to you, and they kind of like sink their teeth into you, and then all of a sudden you get all this legal docs and everything, and it's like, oh no, you're going to do everything that we want you to do.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what did we just discuss? And so her and I have always just kind of had weird vibes from people that we've met in the industry and associated with Hollywood. And, we've met people at parties out there before, and just her and I are like, we just don't trust anybody.
Yeah.
From LA, period.
And it's that same thing. It's like they're like, hey, this is this great opportunity for you.
Right.
Now sign your life away to me, and I'm going to control everything about you.
Exactly. That's the thing, is it's all about control, and it's whatever they want. And that's why we've never really done anything with any production company out there, is because they want total control, and that scares us, right?
Yeah.
So it's just, if you've been in that world before, how they are, and it's just something that we avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
It's just it's a very strange place. It's a very unique place, Los Angeles, and especially there's a reason why we never moved out there, Obviously, like for our careers, it'd probably be a good thing to move out there and get connected with people. And there's just a lot more opportunities out there, which is why people flock to Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Because it's where it's happening. But I feel like it does come at a price. This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money, one of my favorite apps and one that I use every single day. Rocket Money is great for keeping track of all those pesky subscriptions that many of us pay for, and oftentimes we lose track of just how many subscriptions we actually have. By using Rocket Money, not only will it tell you what all your subscriptions are, but it will actually go out and cancel those that you don't want anymore, which is a great feature because it saves you so much time. Nobody likes to get on the phone or have to sit on chat, try to cancel a subscription. Sometimes they're really, really difficult to do, but Rocket Money does it with the tap of a button. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels those unwanted subscriptions. Plus, it monitors your spending and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. I've been using Rocket Money for a while now. I'm actually a paying customer, but it's free to use as well. But you can get some additional features if you pay for it. I find it well worth the money because Rocket Money has saved me hundreds of dollars, maybe even thousands at this point, just by organizing my subscriptions and helping me lower some of my bills. I also love how the dashboard shows me this month's spending versus previous month. You can even see your net worth on there. You can connect all of your accounts, credit cards. It really gives you a central place to view your personal finances and control them in a lot of different ways. You can monitor your spending through email alerts. So if something comes across that's more than usual, it'll let you know so you can go in and investigate. But in addition to them canceling those subscriptions for you, the other big feature that I highly recommend using is allowing Rocket Money to try and lower your bills for you by up to 20%. All you have to do is submit a picture of your bill, and Rocket Money takes care of the rest. They'll even deal with customer service for you, which is amazing. Rocket Money has over 5 million users, and it's saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's features. So stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/lightsout. That's rocketmoney.com/lightsout. Let them know we sent you at rocketmoney.com/lightsout.
Yeah,
Going back to Drake here. Back in January 2004, Nickelodeon premiered the hit show Drake and Josh. Amazing show. Love it. I still watch it from time to time.
I have such great memories. Man, like Megan. I still like that.
Josh
shit
Peck
still makes me laugh to this day. It's great.
And I feel like we all wanted to be the cool guy, Drake, plays in a band. Yeah, me and my brother love that show. We'd watch that together all the time. We'd always argue like who's who. It was like we're
around this time. My friend Mike, who was actually, we were in a band together, and so obviously like the musical elements of Drake Bell was kind of like cool to see. Like, yeah, it's sweet. Like he's playing that sick guitar that we can't afford,
right?
But he actually went to see him live like way back in the day, and he got his autograph on like a $2 bill or something.
Oh wow!
And it was so cool. He brought it to school the next day. I was like, whoa, that's so sick. But then when obviously, spoiler alert, everything came out about him, it was like, oh, this isn't cool anymore. And, don't meet your heroes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, because it can all be shattered in an instant.
Yeah.
Well, Drake and Josh just launched Drake into a whole new level of fame and really changed his life. And just recently, like we mentioned before, on the Quiet on Set docuseries, Drake publicly opened up about what happened to him as a child actor for the first time. So if you're not familiar with Drake Bell, he was actually born Jared Drake Bell on June 27th, 1986, and he began acting when he was only 5 years old, as super, super young. When his parents went through a rough divorce, Drake's father, Joe Bell, got him into acting through Kids Hollywood Connection. And entertaining people and being on stage became Drake's passion early on. His mother, Robin, supported the idea, and he started finding roles in commercials, because that's how a lot of people start.
Yeah.
Actually, I have family members in the showbiz, and they all got their starts in commercials.
Really?
As well as kind of like where I think it's a little bit easier to get cast for commercials, and then the hope is to get into larger shows, which actually one of my cousins is in a large show on Hulu. Actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I would say who it is, but I worry that people will somehow be able to figure out
that's fair. Yeah,
my family connection, and I'm trying to keep my life private as much as possible. But a large show on Netflix with A-list actors. Actually, she stars in.
That's
in
awesome.
that show.
Good for her.
But I just know for them too. I mean, I don't think they've ever opened up to me about any of the negatives, but you can just see that life takes a toll on them.
Yeah.
And they live in Manhattan, New York, so they grew up in New York City and stuff. And I just have watched them over the years develop, and now they're young women, and luckily they're doing very well. But I feel like there's probably more there than what I know. Hopefully nothing horrific, and I don't think anything horrible has ever happened to them, but definitely, I've asked them, like, have you had negative interactions with people? And they're like, oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right.
So it's just kind of the nature of showbiz, I guess.
Yeah.
His first break was landing small roles in Home Improvement, Seinfeld, and Jerry Maguire. And he had big dreams of becoming a series regular on a TV show. In 1999, when he was 12 years old, he got an audition for The Amanda Show. Amanda Bynes expressed interest in wanting Drake Bell on the show. And this was when he first met the Nickelodeon executive, Dan Schneider. Again, Dan isn't the focus of this episode. If you want more info on that, go check out the Sesh episode. They went real deep into Dan Schneider's background and everything that he's done. But it's, of course, important to note his involvement in all of this. He's been called the, quote, king of tween comedies. He created and produced a slew of incredibly popular children's shows on Nickelodeon from 1994 to 2019. And just a few of these include All That, Kenan and Kel, another great show.
That one, yeah.
The Amanda Show, Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly, Sam and Cat, and so many more. As the competition with Disney Channel shows exploded in the late 90s and early 2000s, Nickelodeon's answer was Dan Schneider, and he was their golden child. As decades passed, he became known for inserting sexually suggestive jokes into his TV shows that involved children. He was also accused of asking for massages on set. They were often given by women from the wardrobe department, and there have been rumors of him having inappropriate relations with child stars and also knowing the types of predatory people being hired onto these shows, which is also very alarming. He has also been accused of racism, sexism, harassment, and verbal abuse involving child actors, just to name a few. In response to the Me Too movement in 2018, Viacom CBS interviewed dozens of employees regarding their experiences with Dan. According to Viacom CBS, they didn't find any evidence of sexual misconduct, but many employees claimed he was controlling and verbally abusive towards them. Dan was never charged with a crime, but he soon parted ways from the network, and Nickelodeon claimed that they stopped working with him because he tried to, quote, circumvent the network's standards department by putting up content whose scripts had not been shown to the network for approval. As of 2018, he has creator or co-creator credits on the iCarly reboot and Danger Force, but he has not actively worked on any projects since 2018 that we know of publicly, I guess.
Yeah.
More investigations and information surrounding Dan are expected in the coming weeks. But rewind back to 1999, and Nickelodeon was filming the first season of The Amanda Show at Paramount Studios in front of a live audience. Everything went great for a while, and Drake had fun being on set and doing sketches like Totally Kyle. But things took a turn when they moved the show over to the studio Nickelodeon on Sunset.
So around the same time, 39-year-old Bryan Peck was introduced as a dialogue coach during the second season of The Amanda Show. He got along with everyone, and everyone got along with him. He was known as personable, charming, and downright hilarious. By that point, he had been in the industry for almost 20 years. He had made countless connections in Hollywood, and from early on, he used this status to work with and become close to child actors. So Drake Bell, like many other child actors, was intrigued by Bryan. He specifically liked him because talking with him felt like, quote, reading a book about the history of Hollywood. And they both shared like heavy interest in kind of like old Hollywood. They loved old actors and they just loved shooting the shit about that. But really, Drake, in hindsight, figured that this was all a part of Bryan's calculated plan of grooming him, which is probably spot on. The studio executives promised Drake's father, Joe, who was also Drake's manager at the time, that Bryan was this excellent coach. But he did his dialogue and acting lessons at his private home, which is very strange. Everything seemed fine at first, and Drake's father, Joe, would always be present during these lessons. He was well aware of the dark rumors of the child actor business, so he tried to stay involved and present with his son as much as possible. He never interrupted, but he would always be somewhere kind of a little offset where he could always kind of monitor Drake. And Drake soon loved going over to Bryan's house because, you know, it was this big house. It was decorated with old Hollywood memorabilia. Bryan always threw parties and invited a lot of the child actors there. Their relationship just grew stronger from there because, you know, basically they just had the same interests in show business. Joe then noticed how Bryan just constantly hung around his son on and off set, which started to concern him. Drake would be in his dressing room and Bryan would always pop in to say hi. Joe then noticed he would help Drake with his clothes and subtly touch him when it was just completely unnecessary. He would also do this in front of other people and even in front of Joe. Obviously, just like a million red flags going up. Bryan would also sometimes walk over to Drake to talk about his lines and would put his arm around Drake's waist or over his shoulder and then kind of bring it down his arm, which is very strange. But here's a similar video to get you kind of the idea of what's going on. This is Bryan Peck on the set of Growing Pains with Leo DiCaprio, and this has kind of gone viral lately ever since the docuseries went up. But these are prime examples of how he would subtly touch young actors, and just the things he would say to them are, he cloaks it in humor, but once you know him, it's not funny at all.
Leo, as you know, is the latest, hottest, hunkiest teen idol there is.
Yeah, muscles.
Look, speaking of hunky, huh?
Leo, what's it like to be a teen idol?
Ask Kirk Cameron. I don't. Well, I see my pictures there, and fun seeing those, and I haven't really got the full impact of it yet, so I know we can show them
What?
our little drawings.
Show us the little drawings.
Oh, the
You
little
see,
drawings.
we draw drawings of each other. Bryan is the famous artist, and we always make fun of each other and portray each other in silly, satirical ways.
Leo's job on this set, for some reason, is to make fun of me all day long.
Very concerning.
Yeah.
Hunky?
Yeah. It's just gross.
Just his facial, ugh.
Even as he's like trying to play it off like a joke. And I feel bad for Leo DiCaprio because, I mean, he probably saw him as a friend too,
Yeah.
but you can see even Leonardo DiCaprio redirects some of the jokes where he like shows his muscles like to try and joke about it too. Because it's like, oh, we're just doing a bit here. But he might just be kind of redirecting some weird energy that he's feeling. I don't know. But
Well, you're a kid.
yeah, you're a kid.
So you're not thinking about what's actually going on. You don't think these small little actions are, bad
yeah.
at that time. But looking back, once you're older and you know the truth and the reality of things, that's very disturbing.
Yeah.
I just wonder like how many people at the time saw him doing those things and thought this is kind of weird and just didn't say anything because he is who he is.
Yeah.
Or they're just like, that's just how he is. He's just kind of this like overly friendly person.
I mean, not to jump ahead, but I would argue that I think many people came with their concerns and they were just brushed off.
Right. So this is the exact same behavior Joe saw when Bryan was with his son, Drake. And as a kid, he didn't see this as a problem at the time, but he said that his father, quote, saw it from a mile away. So Joe did go to the higher-ups on the show to voice his concerns about Bryan, and the only defense they had for his behavior was that he was gay. According to Joe, they accused him of being homophobic, saying, quote, "You just don't understand that he's a touchy-feely guy." They quickly dismissed Joe's concerns, saying he started telling others on set how he was uncomfortable with how Bryan was interacting with Drake.
So do you think Joe is like an isolated event, or do you think they were probably used to people coming forward and they had that same exact response to them? Like, no, he's just a touchy-feely guy. You don't understand.
Which, yeah. I mean, that's a fucked up thing to say about, you know,
with kids
put somebody's
involved.
Sexuality out there is like,
oh, true. Yeah.
Right. Like, oh, well, he's gay. So that's just what gay people do.
Yeah. That's
it's
wild.
Like, what?
Yeah.
And then they're calling him homophobic. And it's like,
yeah, it's like,
how does
you're
this make
actually
sense?
being more homophobic.
Right.
Yeah.
How does that make any sense? And again, in a different time period, I guess. And so it's just obviously the optics
True.
on people who are gay are different than they are now. But that's just so many problems with that statement.
That's a great point. I didn't even think of that, because it's like, yeah, you guys are actually the ones stereotyping gay people here. That's wild. That's so wild.
Trying to explain away his actions is like, oh, well, this is normal for gay people.
Yeah,
it's like, what?
What are you talking about?
While Drake was still working on The Amanda Show in 2000, Dan Schneider and the crew were already brainstorming ideas for what would later become the hit buddy comedy, Drake and Josh. The two actors had such great chemistry on The Amanda Show that Dan took Drake out to lunch with his dad present and pitched him this new idea he had for the show. And Drake obviously was like, hell yeah, this is an opportunity of a lifetime and really a dream come true for him. Meanwhile, Bryan was telling Drake that his father, Joe, shouldn't be his manager anymore. When Joe later confronted him about it, Bryan said he believed parents shouldn't be their children's managers. Joe initially just blew it off, but Bryan kept inserting himself into Drake's life. So, a couple different ways to look at that, obviously. I think there's instances with other, Britney Spears is the one that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
Her father's her manager, took control of her career. Not a good thing at all.
And the conservatorship that came on after,
right.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of instances where parents are kind of making their kids do this and then they're taking money from them. And
yep.
I mean, there's so many examples of that.
Yeah, Macaulay Culkin after Home Alone, I think he had a big issue with his parents trying to siphon his money. So yeah, I'm not like against, the idea that parents shouldn't be their kids' managers. I just we know that Bryan saying this, he has an ulterior motive here.
Right.
Because he now knows that Joe's been talking shit about him, that he's been raising the flags, and so now he kind of just wants to silence him.
Bryan would even show up to Drake's concerts, even if they weren't close by. And Drake at the time didn't see this as odd. He was only 14 years old, and he saw Bryan as a coworker and a good friend. It was Drake's first experience in a band and his first time playing live music, and he just figured that Bryan was just another friend showing up to support him. When Drake's 15th birthday was approaching that summer in 2001, Bryan expressed interest in throwing the party at his house. Also very odd. It's like, what? Like, I feel like that's crossing just professional lines.
I would
there.
never, ever host a party for children, unless if it was my own. And
right.
I think that is the only acceptable way to host a party for children, is if it is your own child.
Or a family member.
Or a family member.
Right.
Blood relation, acceptable. Obviously it's his job working with children, but man, like, you just can see everything is transpiring here. And obviously, like, why wouldn't Joe be put on high alert? It's almost so obvious in hindsight,
Well, it's so clear that every opportunity that Bryan gets to put himself in a position of power and control, he does it.
Right.
And obviously having a party at his house, he has control over what happens there. He is, it's his space that people are now entering. So it allows him, opportunity to do what he wants to do, really, because, it's his property, his space.
Yeah.
Drake's father did not want him to host the party, but Bryan insisted. He even sweetened the deal by telling Drake that he could play his live music for all of his friends. And since Drake lived out in Orange County at the time, all of his friends were closer to Bryan's house anyway. So it was the perfect location, it seemed. After the party, Joe noticed a few inappropriate birthday cards from Bryan's friends. He described them as, quote, adult things and, quote, adult descriptions. When he asked his son about it, he said he didn't even know he had those, so they just left it at that.
Ever since then, Joe made it difficult for Bryan to be near his son. In retaliation, Bryan drove a wedge between Drake and his father, and Bryan claimed that Joe was bothering people on set, and he even claimed that he was stealing Drake's money. He quickly convinced Drake that his father was going to be a terrible thing for his career going forward, so Drake began distancing himself even more. Behind the scenes, Joe and Drake's mother, Robin, also rarely got along, and I'm sure there's a lot of family dynamics going on there, but Bryan was aware of this, so he also began telling Robin that Joe was no good for Drake's career, and he convinced them both that Joe was mishandling funds, which was not true. In a later interview, Drake explained that at the time, he didn't fully understand his pay, especially when you have to calculate the taxes that are taken out of it, the cut to agents and managers, but Bryan manipulated him into thinking he should have had way more money than he actually had, and he said it was specifically because his father Joe was stealing from him. But even today, there's been no evidence that Joe ever stole or mismanaged Drake's money from his acting career. But at the time, Bryan made Drake believe this, and in response, Drake went and lived with his mother for a week. After that week, Robin called Joe and told him Drake didn't want him to be his manager anymore, and even though Joe obviously struggled with this and said, quote, "It was breaking my heart," he accepted his son's decision in the end. He knew things would never be the same and their relationship would be severed, but Joe turned over all the management paperwork to Robin. With one final warning, Joe told his ex-wife Robin to never let his son be alone with Bryan, Peck, or go unsupervised. Unfortunately, Robin had already been deceived and manipulated by Bryan. Reminds me of like worm tongue.
Yeah, right.
Just totally deceiving, whispering in people's ears to just completely warp their perception of what's going on. Drake would spend days with his friends and Bryan at Disneyland. Meanwhile, there was an in-between period where production on the Amanda Show had stopped between seasons and they hadn't shot the Drake and Josh pilot yet. So when Drake wasn't acting, he had a lot of free time. Bryan then tried to become a father figure to Drake, knowing that Joe was now mostly out of the picture. He then convinced Robin that he could pick him up and drive him to auditions, and apparently Robin hated driving, especially in LA, I could imagine, so she just accepted the offer. And since Drake's auditions were in LA and Drake lived in Orange County, Bryan convinced him, hey, this is way easier to just stay at my house rather than taking you back to your mom's late at night. That's how he tried to convince Drake that this was all okay. He always found any excuse to get Drake to stay at his house, and he worked his way into basically every aspect of Drake's life.
Which leads us to one morning, Drake was sleeping on the couch where he usually slept at Bryan's house, and he woke up to Bryan assaulting him. Drake was frozen in shock and didn't know how to respond. He didn't know how to deal with this horrible situation he was in. He didn't want to tell his mom what had happened to him, and he had no car to leave the house on his own. He just simply didn't know what to do. Afterward, he was worried of saying he didn't want to go to Bryan's house anymore because he was worried about raising questions. As for Bryan, he was apologetic about it, saying he crossed the line and that it would never happen again. For a while, nothing changed, and Drake continued going to acting and dialogue lessons at Bryan's house. He convinced everyone everything was fine, but it only got worse. Feeling trapped, Drake felt like he had no way out. He described the continued abuse as, quote, extensive and, quote, brutal. Without going into specifics, he explained, quote, and this is from the Quiet on Set series, "Why don't you think of the worst stuff someone could do to somebody as a assault, and that will answer your question. I don't know how else to put it. It was not a one-time thing. It was not an oops." Because the producers just straight up asked him, like, what happened, pretty much.
Yeah.
And this was his response. Ever since that time period, Drake remembers the abusive events, but struggles to remember other aspects of his life. even as his career skyrocketed during Drake and Josh. In the aftermath, Drake began spending a lot of time at his girlfriend's house because he felt safe there. Drake's girlfriend and her mother soon suspected something was wrong. One day, Bryan had planned on taking Drake to Disneyland again, but Drake didn't really want to go. Bryan then called his cell phone nonstop and Drake screened his calls. When Bryan couldn't get a hold of him, he began calling Drake's girlfriend's home phone over and over. Finally, Drake's girlfriend's mom answered the phone and handed it to Drake. As they watched him talk on the phone, Drake made the excuse that he must have double-booked plans that day, and this made Bryan really upset, and Drake ended up hanging up on him. So Bryan kept calling the home phone. His girlfriend's mom immediately thought something suspicious was going on, so she called Drake into the kitchen where they could talk privately. She asked him what was going on, and Drake tried to play it off like nothing was weird, but she could tell that something was off. A 40-something-year-old man wouldn't be calling a 15-year-old boy nonstop for no reason. Still, Drake wouldn't admit everything that was going on, but the girlfriend's mother called Drake's mother, Robin, and told her she was taking Drake to a therapist tomorrow. She could tell something serious was going on, which major kudos to this mom. I mean,
huge.
Mother's intuition is rarely wrong, and what a great move on her part.
And such a great response where it's like, hey, clearly he's not comfortable speaking with me. Maybe we find a third party that he can speak to and we can kind of figure this out. Yeah, props to her.
At the therapist the next day, Drake tried to say everything was fine because he feared that if he said anything, Bryan would make it so he never worked in the industry again.
There you go.
So that looming fear is there. Around the same time, they had to reshoot the Drake and Josh pilot, and Bryan was trying to get Drake to convince Dan Schneider that he should be the dad on the show. Drake dreaded this idea. Not long after, Drake got to a breaking point, and he couldn't tell what exactly triggered it, but he ended up confessing everything to his mother, Robin, over the phone. After that phone call, Robin immediately called the police, and detectives came by to ask questions. During the investigation, Drake had to explain the abuse in excruciating detail to detectives. They also had Drake call Bryan on the phone to gather more evidence while recording it. The goal is to get Bryan to admit to what he had done. As he got him to open up about it, Bryan was paranoid and kept asking if they were being recorded. Luckily, the detectives got what they needed to proceed with the investigations. Soon after, Drake started losing his hair in small chunks and scabs formed on his head. Doctors noticed that he seemed to be physically fine, but clearly his stress levels were extremely high, and it makes total sense.
Yeah. On August 20th, 2003, Bryan Peck was finally arrested on 11 charges. This included lewd or lascivious acts with a child 14 or 15 years of age by a person 10 years older, employment of a minor for pornography, oral copulation by anesthesia or controlled substance, which that's essentially you're harming someone while they're under the influence of something, so they can't comprehend what's going on, sending harmful matter, and using a minor for sex acts. After the arrest, Drake received constant phone calls from friends and coworkers asking if they had heard what happened to Bryan, because they didn't realize that Drake was the one involved because they kept his name anonymous in the case because he was a minor. Dan Schneider also called him and asked if it had anything to do with Drake, and Drake trusted Dan, so he said yes. Dan said he didn't have to talk anymore about it because that was all he needed to know, and then he asked if he was okay or if there was anything he needed. Drake also later called his father, Joe, asking if he heard the news, and Joe, not realizing that his son was the victim in the news, he said he was so glad that Bryan was finally caught and wasn't able to harm his son. Unfortunately, at the time, Drake and Joe had been working on kind of repairing their relationship after they had broken the manager deal. So Drake just didn't have the heart to tell his father at the time that he was the victim. But of course, Joe would later find out, and he was just absolutely devastated and said he's basically never been the same since. And I can't even imagine what he went through. In a later interview, Drake also expressed that his family, including his extended family, has been very supportive of him through the years, and he was able to be empathetic with his father's experience now that Drake is himself a father. In the fall of 2003, Drake began shooting Drake and Josh full time, and he said, quote, "Thank God that I loved what I was doing. When I was on set and doing a scene with Josh, I was able to lose myself and just have fun. And that's awesome because, you know, I don't think that show is now completely soiled, because if anything, it was a shining light for him. So maybe we should, in a way to maintain and preserve our love for that show, it was clearly still a positive thing, despite all the nasty, disgusting things happening, you know, behind the scenes. But unfortunately, around the same time, he still struggled with his trauma, obviously, and he didn't go to therapy, and he began escaping with alcohol and substance abuse. Supposedly the only adult within the Nickelodeon executives that was there for Drake was surprisingly Dan Schneider. And Drake very explicitly doesn't blame Dan for anything that happened, which it goes against a lot of the narrative if you watch,
Right.
you know, the rest of that series. So it's surprising. Bryan later pled no contest to 2 charges of child sexual abuse. In October 2004, Bryan Peck was sentenced to 16 months in prison and ordered to register as a sex offender.
Pretty light sentence.
Yeah, I was going to say
16 months?
16 months is nothing. That's nothing. That's so... This is what I was saying kind of at the top of the episode, that there are no laws to protect children, because we realize you can literally do something like this and essentially get away with it.
Yeah, the laws are just not severe enough. I mean, in other countries, like they'll execute you over this, literally.
Yeah.
Not saying that that's what the punishment should be necessarily, but I do think it should be way more serious
Honestly,
when it comes to crimes against children. Like, this is ridiculous that he just, you know, pleads no contest and then like, all right, 16 months in prison, and then, you know, being registered as a sex offender. And I mean, that whole system is...
Yeah, and we'll kind of see a bit later how he finds a loophole in that quite a bit.
Right.
But Drake, along with his brother and mother, was present during the sentencing, and Bryan's entire side of the courtroom had dozens of supporters. In a later interview, Drake explained the courtroom was full of directors, writers, producers, and actors that he recognized. He called it, quote, mind-blowing, and he said, quote, "My side was me, my mom, and my brother." So, man, after all that, you can tell not even the law, you know, the law is like, oh, 16 months. But then you see the entire industry on his side is, I mean, that says it all, really, doesn't it?
It does.
He recalled telling them all, quote, "How dare you? You will forever have the memory of sitting in this courtroom and defending this person. And I will forever have the memory of the person you are defending violating me and doing unspeakable acts and crimes. And that is what I will remember." Many of Bryan's supporters also wrote letters to the judge, that's meant to influence the sentencing.
Which these letters, when I kind of find out who wrote them, was pretty shocking to me.
Same, yeah.
And obviously, it's hard to know what they were told. And I assume Bryan's legal team reached out to them, or maybe Bryan reached out to them personally because their coworkers or friends of his. But it's like, what did they know about what Bryan did?
That is a big question. I'm glad you brought that up before we get into the letters. And we also know Bryan Peck is just naturally a very charismatic guy, very manipulative. So, you know, he has a lot of influence in the industry. So that's good to note before we dig into these letters to set the scene.
Exactly.
Of, you know, what people knew, what they didn't, what they were told, etc.
Because it's interesting that Dan Schneider and other top executives at Nickelodeon did not write letters of support. And I think it's obvious why. You know, they're trying to play damage control at this point, so they're not going to outright come out and support him. But here are some of the 41 people who supported Bryan Peck with letters during his court case, starting with James Marsden, who I feel like we all know and have seen his work before. His first major role was Cyclops in the X-Men film series directed by Bryan Singer. He was also in Westworld, great show.
Yeah.
The Notebook, one of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
And the Sonic the Hedgehog movies. Here's what some of his letters said. Quote, "I am very proud to say that I've been a close friend of Bryan Peck's for about 14 years now. I assure you, what Bryan has been through in the last year is the suffering of 100 men." End quote.
What Bryan has been through.
Right.
So
Forget
Bryan,
about what Drake's been through.
Yeah, Bryan's the victim here. That's crazy.
He also wrote that Bryan had, quote, learned his lesson, and, quote, the earth would fall from the sky before Bryan would ever think about doing something like this again. Kind of a strange way to put it.
Yeah.
But he went on to say, this is kind of the longer excerpt here, I've known Bryan for 14 years and never once did I ever see any sign of him being capable of something like this. I have lived at his house for months and shared hotel rooms with him, and never once did he ever make me feel compromised or uncomfortable in any way. I don't know what it would take for something like this to occur, but whatever it is extremely out of character for Bryan. I know Bryan very well, and I know how much he has suffered since August of 2003. Bryan is a good person with a very healthy fear and respect for the law. And I assure you what Bryan has been through in the last year is the suffering of 100 men. I don't intend to victimize Bryan, nor would he ever wish that, but I do feel compelled to shed light on the fact that he has learned his lesson. Which is like, how do you know that?
Right.
I guarantee you, very strong statement to make, the earth would fall from the sky before Bryan would ever think about doing something like this again.
I don't intend to victimize Bryan. Well, I don't give a shit about your intent. That's exactly what you did in the letter.
And then saying things like, I guarantee you.
Yeah, what? And I mean, like we were saying, you're saying, what did they know? Did they know the full extent of what happened? Because obviously things are kind of ambiguous. No one's saying like explicitly what he did. It's kind of just this like, Bryan would never think of doing something like this again. It's kind of like this ambiguity there. So maybe you can give them the benefit of the doubt that,
maybe. But even then, like at the very least, what do you think they knew? That he had inappropriate relations with a child?
Right.
And he's still using this kind of language? I mean, I'm like, what level? I guess it really comes down to what did they know?
Right, yeah.
And unless he literally lied to them or his legal team came up with a totally different excuse.
Yeah.
Or just was like, these are blatantly false claims that are being made.
And so like it is a possibility. Like I just, we'll cover our bases here. Like it is in the realm of possibility. But even then,
why would you even risk it?
I know.
Why would you risk your own reputation and career by ever supporting a child predator?
Well, in a weird way, I think they're trying to preserve their reputation and career in Hollywood.
Right.
Right.
They're worried that if they come out against him or don't side with him, then that will affect their career in some way, shape, or form. Because somebody else that Bryan's connected to may change their feelings toward him or affect their future opportunities.
Exactly.
But even then, it's like, where's the morals at?
Right. None. It's vapid. Hollywood has no morals is what we can...
Career, fame, morals. Nah.
Yeah.
Not important.
It's crazy. It's mind-blowing. And then even, after the fact, after the sentencing and everything, like you knew what he was charged with. There's no way you didn't. And you probably, a lot of these actors and the rest that we'll mention, they were probably thinking, hey, this is a sealed court document. My name won't be released, similar to the Ashton Kutcher, Mila Kunis thing,
Which is still naive to think.
Yeah, right.
Like their lawyers wouldn't have been like, hey man, before you do this, there's a possibility your name will come out eventually.
Right, yeah. So that's kind of, I don't know.
It's probably the career thing. It's probably like they don't want this to negatively affect them, or Bryan, once he gets past this, to somehow negatively impact their careers and connections.
Yes.
But it's just like, you really sell your soul to the devil, man.
Yep.
You really do. That's just like,
that's it.
What happens.
Yeah.
And you give up all your morals and for the sake of
the
money,
industry.
fame,
Yeah.
The industry. It's just sickening. The next notable individual who wrote a letter is Taran Killam, who we're all pretty familiar with. He was on the Amanda Show early on, all that, Drake and Josh. Again, all Dan Schneider produced. But he was later on SNL, which is where I know him from, for 6 seasons from 2010 to 2016, and he appeared in a slew of other TV shows and also Broadway theater. Here's some of his letter. It says, quote, "When I found out about Bryan being arrested, I was shocked. Bryan is the last person I would expect to be charged of criminal activities. My first thought was, this is a mistake. I know many of our mutual friends had similar thoughts. It is too out of character. I know for a fact that he regrets any mistakes made, and that this is certainly not something that would ever happen again.
I don't. Same thing as the last one. It's just like you're just trying to cover your ass in the industry.
And they're still trying to help him.
Right. Yeah.
With the judge.
Actively.
They're actively trying to help him get a lesser punishment with these letters.
Yeah.
It's the only reason they're writing them is they're trying to help Bryan out.
Yeah.
It's not just for no reason.
Personally, if someone requested a letter for me to write about Josh, let's say Josh is in hot water legally or something that happened and I'm not fully aware of it. If someone came to me and was like, you need to write a letter of support, I just wouldn't randomly do that without knowing my job's on the line now. But I would be like, I want to know in detail the charges against him. Specifically, I want to look into this case. I want to know everything I can. I would not just write a letter of support for someone willy-nilly because it was requested of me. Clearly for this exact reason, because now all these people are in hot water.
Yep. Again, just morals thrown out the window.
Yeah.
And it's not about what's right and what's wrong. It's just about how do I benefit from this or continue to benefit from this person?
Right.
Which is like, this guy's a sinking ship. Like, why would you hitch yourself to it?
Yep.
Go down with it.
So the next two people on the list are Rich and Beth Correll. It might be Coral. We think it's Correll. Not really sure. But fuck them. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, who cares, really?
They worked on shows like The Amanda Show, All That, Drake and Josh, and Zoe 101. They were also the directors of Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. Rich wrote in his letter, quote, "It would be my pleasure to work with him again." And sure enough, this actually later happened. After Bryan was later released from prison, he was hired on to The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, where he voice acted the character The Mirror in 3 episodes. So he only did voiceover work for the show, and apparently he had no interaction with the cast or crew on set. He was apparently terminated after Disney Channel learned of his criminal history, and his voiceovers were then replaced. So you probably, a lot of us, if you're interested in this, you might have seen that video of him as the Mirror. I could not confirm. I think that is the replacement voiceover and not actually the voice of Bryan Peck, but court documents stated that Bryan was only, quote, prohibited from direct contact with children, not from being part of productions in which children are acting. So there's a little loophole that he found, and I do dig into this a bit later, so stick around if you want the law mumbo jumbo into how they found kind of this loophole. But the Corrells told the producers of Quiet on Set that they, quote, had no input or involvement in the casting of Bryan Peck. They also said that when they asked Peck about the case, he, quote, simply replied that the problem had been resolved. And so we'll loop back to Bryan's work in Hollywood after prison a little bit later, but wild that the letter of support was like, oh, I would for sure work with him again. And sure enough, he absolutely did.
The next individual we're going to mention is Joanna Kearns, and she's famous for her role as Maggie Seaver in Growing Pains. And here's some of her letter. It says, quote, "In the 7 years we worked together, there was never a second of doubt about his appropriateness with children he worked with. I have never known Bryan to engage in the type of illegal activity with which he is charged, and can only believe that there must have been some extreme situation or temptation exerted upon him to influence his actions."
Nah.
Just straight victim blaming right here. That is despicable.
Yeah. And even if you didn't know the entire situation, even if you want to give these people the benefit of the doubt, just that language, that verbiage shows you're ready to victim blame. So disgusting.
She later told the producers of Quiet on Set that her letter of support was based on misinformation.
There you go.
She said, quote, "Knowing what I know now, I never would have written it." Which, I don't know, man.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a little too late to be like, oh,
whoops. Yeah.
You came pretty strong pretty hard with that letter there.
And that's even more of a flaw in this. If you didn't know the extent of what was going on and it's based on misinformation, you're still saying terrible things.
Yeah,
in this letter.
right.
Yeah.
Whether it's about him or any other
alleged
predator. I mean, why on earth would you say, like, put it back on the victim? Like, oh, there must have been temptation there that was exerted upon poor Bryan. Like,
God,
I don't know.
Yeah.
Next person is Alan Thicke, famous for his role as Dr. Jason Seaver on Growing Pains. And when he was 31, he began dating the actress Christy Swanson when she was 17. He died in 2016, but in his letter of support to the judge, he said that Bryan, quote, apparently made a gigantic mistake which will haunt him for life. And he said he was, quote, highly professional and nurturing mentor to the child actors on his set. He also said, quote, Bryan's integrity and self-respect have always been important to him, and this turn of events has been mortifying to him in ways that will only make him a better, stronger citizen in the future.
Yeah, these two were also a stab in the heart for me because I grew up on Growing Pains as well. And knowing that these people just, no moral compass here. The next one is a guy called Tom DeSanto. He worked on all the Transformer movies and was the producer and story writer of X-Men and producer of X2, which is also directed. Those were directed by Bryan Singer. The reason we keep bringing up Bryan Singer, the connection between James Marsden and now Tom DeSanto, we'll see a bit later, but keep that name in mind. But in Tom's letter, he described Bryan as, quote, a well-respected and loved professional. He said his arrest was, quote, surprising and uncharacteristic. In parts of the letter that were redacted to keep Drake Bell anonymous, Tom said that Drake, quote, came across as very mature yet complex, end quote. He was dealing with a lot of personal issues and Bryan was someone he could talk to. So disgusting. So he knew. He knows. And he knew Drake Bell was 14 or 15 at the time. And he's saying, he came across very mature. God.
Part of me wonders if they really thought that these were false allegations and that the charges were going to be dropped and Bryan would come out on top as the winner in this. And they gambled hard on that, if that's what happened. But
it is something to consider. Not
that I believe that at all.
It is
just trying to think from their perspective.
Right.
Why?
Why would you do it?
Going so strong in his favor when you don't know?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is something to consider, is even though it feels disgusting to try and give these people the benefit of the doubt, it's just a way to explain what the hell is going on at the time with these people. But I mean, he also said that Drake behaved differently with various people and, quote, seemed to be very fearful of his father and unable to communicate with him whatever sexual issues he was going through at the time.
Which this is something a few people allude to.
Yeah.
That Drake was doing or having sexual issues or questioning his sexuality a little bit. Right, I don't know exactly, but
there is. In the next letter we mentioned, it's also brought up. Tom also wrote, quote, I know Bryan has learned from his mistakes, and if I had children, I would be 100% comfortable leaving them in his care.
I fucked Tom DeSanto.
Dude.
What? I wonder if he walked that one back.
Yeah, how could you? How could you walk that back?
What? I mean, he's just he's just going all in for Bryan.
Yep.
Telling the judge, oh yeah, I would feel 100% comfortable leaving my kids with him.
So wild. It just sucks because with every name, you just start to see the spider web being weaved and how deep this runs and who would just forget their morals and support people.
Well, it makes you really wonder if Bryan has dirt on them.
Oh my God. Yeah. That's a reality too.
Is there people protecting each other in this?
For sure.
And it's if something ever happens, you come to my aid, I'll come to yours.
Yeah.
And especially when you talk about how deep this goes, and it really makes me wonder, this is what's happening, is there's this protection going on amongst all of these all these people.
Yeah. So yeah, now in this next letter, Kimmy Robertson will kind of see, this might be one of the worst ones of them all. Not that we need a tier list for these, but Kimmy Robertson played Lucy Morin in Twin Peaks. Great show. She did a bunch of voice acting roles and guest starred on a season 1 episode of Drake and Josh. She was actually one of the few who delivered a handwritten letter to the judge, which, I mean, that shows a lot if you're willing to do a handwritten one. Everyone else was typed as far as I could see. It said, quote, "I noticed this young man," who she's referring to Drake Bell, "kept asking me about Bryan and generally being sleuth-like. I also noticed no gay male, i.e. makeup, hair, or PA, wanted to be alone in a room with him. I believe with all my heart that Bryan was pressured and pushed beyond belief before he caved in with," the name was redacted, but it's Drake Bell. She calls him "an outrageous, overtly gay, oversexed person with no idea what he is doing to Bryan. He totally took advantage of Bryan's willingness to help anyone who needs it."
Wow.
That might be one of the worst ones. Just egregious victim blaming and not even victim blaming, straight up victim attacking here is what's going on.
And potentially saying slanderous things that are untrue. Potentially.
Yeah.
Again, we just don't know, but
True.
Terrible nonetheless. That leads us to Will Friedle, which,
this one hurt.
He played Eric Matthews on Boy Meets World and Ryder Strong. He played Sean Hunter on Boy Meets World. Brian Peck had guest starred on the show several times and worked as a dialogue coach. On a recent episode of Pod Meets World, which is like their podcast that they do now, Will, Ryder, and Danielle Fishel, who played Topanga, talked about the situation with Bryan and the letters. Will Friedle said that he became close with Brian Peck right when he joined the show. He was, quote, extremely charming and, quote, very personable. And he was one of the only adults who would go out to lunch with the child actors. Bryan would also show up at Ryder Strong's house during parties. Very concerning. Maitland Ward, their co-star on Boy Meets World, also confirmed that Will was good friends with Brian Peck throughout the run of the show. When Peck was accused in 2003, he called Will and was crying while, quote, instantly spinning it to where it wasn't his fault. It was clearly the fault of his victim. At first, Will believed him. So if that is true, that kind of confirms our suspicions that he spun this in a certain way so that his friends would come to his aid. He said, quote, "My instinct initially was, my friend, this can't be. It's got to be the other person's fault. The story makes complete sense the way that he's saying it. At the time, Will was just finishing filming for a role in a movie that Bryan had got him, so he felt indebted to him." There's that power.
There it is.
Ryder said, quote, "He didn't say that nothing had happened, so by the time we heard about this case and knew anything about it, it was always in the context of, I did this thing, I am guilty. I'm going to take whatever punishment the government determines." Both actors claim they didn't know the extent of the charges. Bryan then asked them both to support him in court, and they did. Will said, quote, "We're sitting in that courtroom on the wrong side of everything. The victim's mother turned and said, 'Look at all the famous people you brought with you, and it doesn't change what you did to my kid.' I just sat there wanting to die. It was like, whoa, what the hell am I doing here? It was horrifying all the way around." He also said, "We weren't told the whole story, but it doesn't change the fact that we did it. There's an actual victim here, and he turned us against the victim to where now we're on his team." That's the thing where, to me, I look back at that as my ever-loving shame for this entire thing. If you're more curious about what they had to say, you can go check out their Pod Meets World episode that aired on February 19, 2024. But I think that gives you a pretty good idea of where those guys stand.
Yeah.
All these Hollywood directors, producers, and actors might have supported Brian Peck the same way the Boy Meets World actors did at the time. They might have been ignorant of the extent of his crimes, and some argue they were deliberately misled and manipulated about what exactly Bryan had done. And the details of the court case had not been publicized at the time they wrote those letters, which is kind of what we tried to allude to before we went into the letters, but that's the reality. Keep in mind that many of these actors also owed much of their careers to Bryan. Some of these letters use words like temptation, extreme pressure, or jail-baited. Kimmy Robertson said that Bryan was, quote, pressured, and he, quote, caved in. These are terms used to blame the victim, of course. It also shows that Bryan had confessed to some or all of what he did, possibly in private. Again, it's unclear how much and to whom he discloses to. But any way you look at it, terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, the letter's just, I mean, it's just
awful.
like, why on earth would you even put yourself in that position to be on the side of a convicted child predator?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's tough. And it raises the question, what's genuine, what's not? It's hard to find the answer to that. But Drake did mention the Boy Meets World actors in a March 23rd interview. And he said, quote, some people have tried to get ahead of the story and say, oh, we were manipulated. We didn't understand what was going on at the time. He told us something different. But it's very interesting that they didn't say that until they knew that the letters were about to be released. The documentary team had contacted these people, including the Boy Meets World actors, long before the docuseries aired because, they were the ones that unsealed the letters. He also explained that, quote, he felt bad for throwing people under the bus, but he speculated that both Will and Ryder had time to form their responses and claimed they were ignorant of the full story. So yeah, it's hard to pin what's truth and what's not. Drake had also worked in a movie with Will after the Bryan Peck case, and he was basically upset because at any point he could have just talked to him about what had happened, but he ended up emphasizing that, quote, everyone deals with trauma in different ways. We're all human. So I don't know. Drake kind of had a mature response to it and kind of an open-minded one, because I think there is enough benefit of the doubt in here somewhere, depending on the person. But on March 22nd, 2024, Drake Bell said he hadn't gotten a personal apology from anyone who wrote or signed letters of support for Bryan Peck. A few days later, on March 25th, the directors Rich and Beth Carell publicly apologized. They wrote, quote, we extend our deepest apologies to Drake Bell and his family, and we deeply regret our decision many years ago to request leniency for someone who we later learned had committed a horrible crime and caused so much pain and trauma to Drake and others. There are no words to express how awful we feel for being on the wrong side of a horrific situation and the trauma it caused you, Drake. We are devastated that we unwittingly supported the unsupportable. So there's their apology. As far as I could find, no one else up until this recording had openly apologized. Obviously, Will and Ryder have talked about it on their podcast, but
easy to apologize when it's all public now.
Yep, it's already happened.
It's just, I don't know. I feel like I'd have a hard time believing this was genuine.
Yeah.
And that it's just not to save face.
Yep.
But
no, I'm on board with that too. Yeah. Like most, Drake had also recently found out about the letters of support when the docuseries requested the court to unseal them. Some of these supporters were people who worked with Drake on Drake and Josh, so you can imagine how much of a betrayal that was. In a recent interview, Drake said, quote, there were people in positions of power that were my bosses. They were directors, they were producers. It was a situation where I thought I was safe. I thought, okay, I thought I got rid of the cancer that has been carved out. We're better now. And I had no idea that for 4 years, I was working alongside people who had supported him and probably in the back of their mind were thinking of me in a certain way. And I thought they were my friends. Here's another thing, man. This goes to show how quickly misinformation can spread. His old coworker, Josh Peck, also came under fire when the docuseries aired. People claimed that Josh's, quote, silence was deafening since he didn't respond for a while. On March 24th, 2024, a Facebook post that had the TMZ logo on it fueled the rumor mill. And this fake post claimed that Josh's wife, Paige O'Brien Peck, wanted a divorce after she found proof of Josh accepting hush money from Nickelodeon's producer Dan Schneider back in 2023. You can take a look if you're watching the YouTube. Here's the post. But there is no evidence to support the claim that Josh Peck accepted hush money from Dan Schneider, and many people who circulated the image on the internet have since deleted it. The Facebook post's image has several grammatical errors, and the font is different from a typical TMZ post, which makes it obvious this isn't a legitimate report. There are also no reports from credible sources that Josh Peck and O'Brien are divorcing at the time of this recording. And I mean, yeah, this whole thing was just fabricated, but some internet troll just decided to ride this wave and cause a stir, I guess. But Drake has also defended Josh, saying that he reached out to him privately and supported him, which did mean a lot to Drake. He thinks of Josh as a brother, and they have both had their ups and downs, but through tears he said, quote, "I would always be there for him, and I know that he would be the same. That's something very unique, especially in this industry." So to jump around a little bit here, I mentioned Bryan Singer earlier, and as it turned out, Brian Peck had connections to this famous director. And also James Marsden, as I said, and Tom DeSanto were two of Brian Peck's supporters during his trial who also had connections to Bryan Singer. So I was kind of proud of myself. These were dots that I kind of connected. But, Brian's most famous for directing a slew of X-Men movies, and basically the most successful ones. He also directed The Usual Suspects, which is regarded as a classic. And he was later kicked off the Bohemian Rhapsody project that came out in 2018. But I'll try to keep this one short because the focus is on Brian Peck at the end of the day, but it's hard to see these connections and not at least bring this up. So allegations against Singer are it's just a whole nother Hollywood can of worms. And he has also been accused many times of assault against minors between 1997 and 2019. Many of the cases have been dropped and others were settled. But author Bret Easton Ellis, who famously wrote the book American Psycho, which later became a movie, claimed two of his former partners had attended underage sex parties hosted by Bryan Singer and fellow director Roland Emmerich. Bryan's Hollywood career finally came to an end after the Me Too movement took off, and in 2019, The Atlantic published an investigative report where 4 men alleged that Bryan Singer sexually assaulted them when they were underage. Many of the victims were connected to the industry, and Bryan responded that this was, quote, a homophobic smear piece. But I know I've heard about Bryan Singer for a very long time in the industry, and this was the first people that my radar went off on. He's known for being the guy where openly, in a hotel hot tub, he'd be with a bunch of 15-year-old boys and everyone kind of looked the other way. This, he had rumors circulating about him for years and years and years. And it finally took that Atlantic piece to finally tip people off, maybe we shouldn't be working with this guy anymore. But allegedly, many people in Hollywood have worked with Bryan Singer and have known about his behavior for years. And the same way Drake saw Brian Peck, many of these young aspiring actors saw Bryan Singer as an industry role model. And it's no wonder why both predators had strong connections in the industry. Brian Peck was allegedly very good friends with Bryan Singer, and he also had cameos in X-Men and X-Men 2. So, the spiderweb keeps just growing and getting deeper, and yeah, it's Never Meet Your Heroes 2, because one of my favorite Marvel movies of all time is The Days of Futures Past.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's I had such a blast seeing that movie in theaters, and it wasn't long after that one that I started hearing things about him, and people were posting no, Bryan Singer is actually a piece of shit. And
yeah, just wish there was a better way to go after these guys. It just seems God, the amount of damage they've done.
Yep.
Without being held responsible, and they've use their money and fame and power and connections to evade prison time, which is where these guys belong. I mean, if they're doing these things that they're accused of, right. It is scary that they're out there.
And there's no way that more people don't know about this, right? And I think they just look at the numbers. They're like, hey, this dude is crushing it with X-Men. He's making us tons and tons of money. And this was even after Disney bought Marvel. So this is a Disney employee essentially. And I think they just look at the numbers and they say, yeah, we know this thing about this guy and there's been rumors for years, but we're going to keep looking the other way because he keeps making content that's incredible. So
as long as their stock prices keep going up.
Yep.
It's just, I know we've said it a million times on the show, but it's just so sad that it's money over over everything.
Morals. Yeah.
Money over morals. Just a sick world.
It really is.
And obviously we can't not mention another predator associated with Nickelodeon, Jason Michael Handy. This guy's truly sick and disturbing, and took things to a whole nother level. But he was working on the Amanda Show, and he was a production assistant where his job was to escort the child actors around from one place to another. And he was also known to be charming and charismatic, similar to Bryan. His victim goes by the alias Brandy. She had been cast when she was 11 years old to be in one of the Judy Trudy classroom skits on the Amanda Show. Once Jason became friends with Brandy, he emailed her a picture of himself naked, masturbating. Disgusting. He said he sent the email because, quote, he wanted her to see that he was thinking of her.
Just a blatant predator here.
And seemingly proud of it in a way, and just bold, which is even scarier. After Brandy's mother found out, they did not go to the police, but they left the show and the industry entirely, which that was one of the frustrating things.
Not going to police.
Not going to police, and not like as a parent.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know. I don't understand it.
Me either.
It's just like, that's your child. That's like your fucking job is to protect your child, and over everything else. Nothing else matters but your child's safety.
And even going beyond that, not only your child, but when you don't go to police about this, you're effectively risking all the other children.
Absolutely.
On set.
Yeah. Officials later contacted Brandy and her mother in 2003 after receiving a tip about Jason having a lot of inappropriate materials at his Sherman Oaks residence. Over 1,700 images of minors in explicit positions, 7 videos, as well as several tagged Ziploc bags were recovered from his place. And these bags contained, quote, tokens from different young girls. One of them even contained the underwear of a 7-year-old, and one of them had Brandy's name on it with the letters she had written to him inside. Truly disgusting. Jason was finally arrested on April 12, 2003, and in his diary, he admitted that he was, quote, a pedophile, full-blown, with a, quote, desire for little girls. He also said, quote, I even struggle on a day-to-day basis of how I can find a victim to if I have to. Not long after this, he assaulted a 9-year-old who worked on the Nickelodeon show Cousin Skeeter. In 2004, Jason pled no contest to lewd acts on a minor, distributing explicit material by email, and child sexual exploitation. Court records claimed he assaulted his then 9-year-old victim by forcefully kissing her in her home while playing video games together in 2002. He then told her not to tell her mom. He was sentenced, you would think, oh, this guy's going away for life.
Yeah.
No, he was sentenced to 6 years behind bars, but released early on parole in 2009. And he was allowed to relocate to North Carolina as a registered sex offender. That is alarming.
6 years?
And early, he was released early.
Like, give me a break.
But people go to prison for life for selling marijuana.
Right, yeah.
It's like, what is going on here?
The priorities are so backwards.
Again, it's like the moral compass of, I feel like the whole country, the government is just gone.
Yeah.
It's
it's hard to go through these episodes without like becoming a cynic. Yeah. It's like, what?
And guess what? Because they let this guy out, he reoffended. In 2014, Jason was arrested again from his home on October 7th for 3 counts of felony indecent liberties with a child, plus 2 counts of felony sex offender violations. He was held on a $1 million bond. He was soon convicted again, and this time it was in the federal jurisdiction. Today, 49-year-old Jason is incarcerated at the low-medium security federal correctional institution in Petersburg Medium in Virginia. As of this recording, he has a potential release date of August 28, 2038.
Gonna release this dude again.
He's gonna reoffend again. That's what happens with these predators. There is no rehabilitating this.
Yeah, keep this guy locked, man. I don't get it. I do not understand it.
It's just so sad. It's just so sad that children have to go through this, and it is detrimental to them beyond anything that we know. It
Right.
is psychologically, physically traumatizing. It impacts them for a lifetime. And yet they have to live with this trauma and try to move forward in their life. Yet this motherfucker gets to come out of prison and essentially live a free life again.
Yeah. It makes no sense.
And had they had just put him away for good, then he would have never done it again. Victimizing more children, impacting more children. It's just like,
Yeah.
our system is so
Yeah.
fucked up. I'm sorry. It's just,
There's no other way to cut this. I don't, even if I were to try and play devil's advocate here, I would have no explanation for why we let this guy out early and he potentially is now getting out again. I could not make a defense argument for this dude. It's so wild to me. But yeah, and then, there is the old saying where it's like these people who are the victims of this kind of become the perpetrators.
yeah,
of this.
sometimes it happens.
And we kind of see this in the case. I'll loop it back around to Drake Bell, because beyond the accusations, lawsuits, and convictions of Hollywood production assistants, directors, and acting coaches, I think Jason might have been some freelance like escort, but Drake Bell has his own criminal history. And in 2021, he pled guilty to a felony charge of attempted child endangerment and a misdemeanor charge of disseminating matter harmful to juveniles related to inappropriate text messages he sent to a teenage girl in 2017. He was sentenced to 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service. Drake's victim had called him the, quote, epitome of evil. She accused him of grooming that began at the age of 12 and abused her at the age of 15. She also accused him of sending pictures of his genitals. She said, quote, he was calculating. He preyed on me and sexually abused me. He is a monster and a danger to children. So these are the accusations against Drake Bell. And here are some of her own words during the trial process.
He replied by telling me that he couldn't wait to see me. He also asked me, quote, how old are you now? I told him 15. He then told me to, quote, hurry up. Don't smile at me. Not too long after that, his messages to me became blatantly sexual. This eventually led to many months of inappropriate messages and photos being exchanged over Instagram and Snapchat. The photos exchanged included photos of my body and photos of his body and his genitals. In the beginning, I was excited. I thought that he really liked me, and I thought that I meant something to him. But that didn't last. Back then, the last thing I wanted was to lose him, not only because I was completely infatuated with him, but because I became scared of him. There were times where I felt really uncomfortable talking to him in such graphic sexual ways and wanted to be left alone. But I had a very hard time telling him that because I was terrified of upsetting him, so I would make excuses. When I did, quote, upset him, he made me cry. If I didn't give him what he wanted, he was spiteful. It made me feel guilty. He made me feel disgusting and absolutely awful about myself. At that point, it was clear that he was the one who was in control. I felt trapped and stuck because I still idolized him. He had me wrapped around his finger. This caused a tremendous amount of stress and shame, crimes that he committed against me in Cleveland. I want to make something very clear. The reason that these particular incidents did not result any further than oral was because the defendant knew that I was menstruating at the time. Had I not been menstruating then, he would have me. Don't look at me like that. Because he would tell me how badly he wanted to me, but used much more vulgar language. On December 1st, 2017, my aunt took me to the Odeon Concert Club to watch him perform. That night, the defendant took me backstage to be alone with him. He started kissing me, and the night ended in him having me perform oral on him twice. The next incident happened on December 2nd, 2017, while I was alone with him in his hotel room. He had talked to me about seeing me one last time before we all left Cleveland and went home. So we went to his hotel to say goodbye. In his hotel room, he started kissing me and had me perform oral on him again. My aunt was right outside the room waiting in the hallway while this was happening. She trusted him and never thought that he would ever do anything to hurt me.
Obviously, that testimony is very concerning, and the allegations are very serious. And again, alluding back to kind of the overarching theme of this episode is those in power and control positions are using that to their advantage and doing things that are illegal, thinking that they're going to get away with it because of this dynamic that they're in. And it's sad. It's very sad to sit there and listen to her talk about everything that she went through. And, you know, I stand with victims, and, you know, I'm not going to doubt anything that she went through. It's clearly, you know, a very traumatic situation for her. And I think, you know, the court systems don't always get it right. You know, they don't always, you know, justice isn't always served in these cases. And seems like that's potentially what happened with this particular case.
Yeah. And, you know, it's hard to say, but really in the grand scheme of things, it's history repeating itself with the same person, though, just on the other end of it. Like, you could see it as like, you know, we think it's egregious that Bryan Peck only served, you know, basically nothing for that sentence. You could kind of see now this situation against Drake Bell. It's like, oh, well, in the end, he didn't really pay for the alleged extent of his crimes. So it's wild to see it like on either sides involving the same guy. It's kind of just happening again. But
which throughout history has definitely happened in other cases. I know we've even covered cases where the victim initially becomes the perpetrator later on because it's kind of like what they know.
Yeah.
And it's a learned behavior that they learn through their own experiences and then later on act upon, which, you know, is very, very unfortunate. And again, not saying that in every case when allegations come forward like this, that there's not, you know, some of them are not truthful or there's other motives for why they're doing things. But again, I mean, that's what the court's there to do, is to figure that out and to hopefully provide justice when it's warranted. And, you know, it doesn't mean it's always done properly or done to the fullest extent. So I think it's just like, we don't know at the end of the day. It's like what she's saying is one thing, and then we're about to hear from Drake and his response. And also just the mere fact that Drake was not charged with physical sexual assault. His defense insisted that the contact was only through text messages, not even photos, nor anything sexual in nature. And that could just be because that's what happened. That's the truth. Or it could just be there's no way for the victim to prove these things that she's alleging happened. And that's really where it's very hard to say one way or another. And, you know, that's what the court's there to do and figure out. But I mean, just a terrible situation all the way around. So here's Drake's response to, because he's on Zoom too. He doesn't even show up. He's on Zoom, and you heard her get upset with the way that he looked at her.
Yeah, I was going to clarify that's her talking to him through the Zoom call.
So let's take a look at his response.
Your Honor, I just want to say today that I accept this plea because my conduct was wrong. I'm sorry that the victim was harmed in any way, but that was obviously not my intention. I have taken this matter very, very seriously. And again, I just want to apologize to her and anyone else who may have been affected by my action.
Yeah, and we've talked about it before with sexual assault cases. It's really hard to find the truth. So,
and I just think there's, in my opinion, there's no excuses for this kind of behavior. I think anybody who's in a position of power over someone, especially in a celebrity fan situation, that's always going to be a very tricky relationship to navigate.
Yeah.
And then, that's not even bringing the fact that there's the age disparity there.
Yeah.
But just the fan to, public figure, celebrity thing, like that is just something that you should never even tread, because it's just, this is what happens. These types of things can happen, and it puts you in a position where you have, maybe in your eyes, you don't feel like there's some leg up on the person, but there is, because that person idolizes you. They look up to you, and they're a fan of you and a fan of your work. And I mean, it's just,
I think the music industry also, if we're going to put Hollywood on blast,
music
also,
for sure.
And that, you go back to any of the quote unquote like rock gods of your dad's classic rock, which I grew up on. They all did shit. All of them. Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Red Hot Chili Peppers. You go down the line, all of them. And this hits close to home too, because I was in the music scene in Detroit, and we just found out someone alongside us. You go look him up, Evan Mercer. He was in this band Max Saturn. Yeah, it came out pedophile.
Wow.
He had all these images. He was doing shit on like Omegle. And it hit really close to home for all of us who used to be in the music industry. But he was, there were rumors that like they were bringing underage people backstage, and it's just a tried and true method for these predators, and they'll use any power, and they know people, you see people on stage and you get stars in your eyes, and they know how to take advantage of that.
Yep.
But yeah, so the music industry as well, and because we do know Drake Bell was a part of it, was, his music scene. So just to give, the other side of the story here, Drake later explained that he stopped responding to the fan in question after learning their age. He said, quote, "This individual continued to come to shows, paid for meet and greets, and all the while I was unaware that this was the same person that I was communicating with online, and that's what I pled guilty to. I want to make clear that there were no sexual images, nothing physical between me and this individual. I was not charged with anything physical. I was not charged with disseminating of photographs or images or anything like that. This is strictly over text messages." And when I was presented with a plea deal, because of the messages, I felt that it was the best way to get this over quickly and for everyone involved to be able to move on, and for me to get back to doing what I love, and that's making music for you. Also, the plea deal comes into play because, usually when people take a plea deal, that they might be getting a lesser sentence.
Right.
There might have been more going on. Who knows? But he also elaborated, quote, "I took responsibility for that. I did what was asked of me, but the media grabbed a hold of so much misinformation and it absolutely destroyed me. And I started to spin out of control." He also explained, "It's been a 3-year thorough investigation into every false claim that's been made. And it's not me telling you that the claims are false, but the state of Ohio has proven the claims to be false. If these claims were remotely true, my situation would be very different. I would not be here at home with my wife and my son." The New York Times recently made a retraction they had published about this case, stating that he had to register as a sex offender. This error existed for about 2 to 3 years in their publication, which is surprising for the New York Times. And on March 18th, 2024, they finally corrected the information, stating he was not required to register as a sex offender. But yeah, it's pretty bottomless. It's just, it keeps going,
Yep. In 2020, Drake's ex-girlfriend, Melissa Lingefelt, came out claiming that Drake verbally and physically abused her back when they were dating around 2006. At one point, she claimed he dragged her down the stairs at one of their houses and her face hit the stairs on the way down. I actually have some audio of her accusation, which we'll play it now.
First, I would like to start out with saying that I don't really care if anyone believes me, as this is my story and my life, and something that I went through. It wasn't until recently that I actually realized that abuse isn't something that all women have to go through. When I started dating Drake, I was 16. I was homeschooled. I moved in with him. I was singing. It wasn't until about a year when the verbal abuse started. And when I say verbal abuse, imagine the worst type of verbal abuse you could ever imagine, and that was what I got. It then turned into physical, hitting, throwing, everything. At the pinnacle of it, he dragged me down the stairs of our house in Los Feliz. My face hit every step on the way down. I have photos of this. I don't even want to get into the underage girls thing. I mean, I will, but I'm scared.
Melissa also featured a screenshot of what she described as a text conversation she had with a friend who claimed they recalled Drake's abuse toward her. It read, quote, "I remember the pics. I remember the physical fights. I remember him throwing you in a bathtub and scalding you with water." The friend wrote, "I remember him breaking all of your antiques, and I also remember calling the cops on him and having to stay at Molly's house until shit fizzled over." In an Instagram story, she wrote that other people knew of the abuse. Quote, "Everyone that really knows me and has been a friend of mine for the past 15 years knows all too well of the abuse that Drake Bell put me through. I have so many witnesses. I have photos. It was my life. If you don't believe me, it is clear to me what kind of person you are, and I don't need that on my side." She also went on to say, "Nobody wants attention from abuse. I hope this gives girls the strength to come out about their experiences with him because I know for a fact he has hundreds of victims." Wow. Drake denied all these allegations against him. He claimed his relationship with her, quote, "ended more than a decade ago. We unfortunately both called each other terrible names, as often happens when couples are breaking up, but that is it." These accusations were not mentioned in that docuseries interview he did. He also said, quote, "Right after Drake and Josh, I was signed, and then I released my second album. I made some really cool movies, but I would have stints of sobriety, and then I would, the pressure would be too much. And all these demons that I had were very difficult to work through. And so I think a lot of my self-destructive behavior would always just be a temporary fix, and it would always creep back up. I went through bankruptcy and lost my house. I mean, it was absolutely devastating." In an interview after the airing of Quiet on Set, Drake said he had checked into rehab before the docuseries interview. He spent his time in group therapy and trauma therapy to prepare himself for the interview. After everything that happened with Bryan, Drake said, quote, "I was hoping that the outcome would be that he goes to jail. He's there for a while and that he would never be able to work with kids again," which would in turn pretty much mean that you're not going to work in Hollywood because very few productions don't have at least one kid on set. That's not what happened at all. Because once Bryan was released from prison, he found work again, including on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, as we mentioned earlier, 7 feature films, and 2 other TV shows. On the TV show Anger Management with Charlie Sheen, he found work as a dialogue coach, and he also worked as a dialogue coach in the kids' movie Jack and the Beanstalk in 2009.
So I kind of alluded to this earlier. I was curious what exactly, quote, "no direct contact with children" actually means in the eyes of the law, since Bryan apparently found a way to still work in these Hollywood projects that involve children. So here's a bit of what I found. This is from the official United States Court's website in regards to Chapter 3, Association and Contact Restrictions, Probation and Supervised Release Conditions, B, Sample Condition Language. Quote, "You must not have direct contact with any child you know or reasonably should know to be under the age of 18, including or not including your own children, with the permission of the probation officer. If you do have any direct contact with any child you know or reasonably should know to be under the age of 18, including or not including your own children, without the permission of the probation officer, you must report this contact to the probation officer within 24 hours. So direct contact includes written communication, in-person communication, or physical contact. Direct contact does not include incidental contact during ordinary daily activities in public places. You must not communicate or otherwise interact with, name a victim, either directly or through someone else without first obtaining the permission of the probation officer. So if Bryan's sentencing included similar verbiage than this, then nothing explicitly states he cannot work on productions involving children. That's why they specify direct contact and what direct contact actually means. So after Bryan was released from prison, Drake also remembered seeing him at a restaurant at the table with about a dozen actors, all males between the ages of 14 and 16. Drake said, quote, "I saw that he was right back to what he was doing and I turned around and left." So there's an accusation that he's even breaking the direct contact protocol.
There's nobody watching him. So it's like unless somebody rats him out or calls his probation officer, they're not going to know.
Yeah.
And that's the big issue with dealing with sex offenders is that there's nobody keeping tabs. So it's like, yeah, they have some of these orders in place and directives that they have to follow, but it's like, who's checking in on them? I mean, this probation officer probably has a long list of people that they have to keep track of. And it's like, they have no way of knowing if he's actually following these things.
LA probation officer is probably an aspiring actor.
Right.
It's probably some bullshit like that. Who knows what's going on?
When Bryan was asked about the docuseries, he said, quote, "No comment on it. Of course not." Bryan Peck still lives in Los Angeles, California as of 2024, and he has not worked in the industry since 2019.
Or at least has not been credited.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, he's making a living somehow.
Yeah.
It's probably not delivering pizzas or something.
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully not that. That probably violated his order too. But the unfortunate reality is that people like Bryan Peck are only the tip of the iceberg in Hollywood sexual abuse. Again, like we have talked about this entire time, it's a systemic problem that unfortunately has not been solved by just exposing predators. Drake explained in a later interview that even if you try to speak out in an environment similar to the one he was in, you're seen as a problem that needs to be removed. With that said, he acknowledges the joy his shows have brought to countless people, and he said that recently coming forward publicly about the sexual abuse has been a, quote, freeing experience. Hopefully it will encourage others to come forward as well, and with enough exposure, the industry might finally change its ways. Doubt it.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Like, yeah. How can it change its ways? It's like you have to like publicly execute someone at this rate and do an entire docuseries on someone to finally get after the fact, he's not even credited anymore. And it's like, finally now his name is in the zeitgeist and we know, hey, this guy's a problem, but he's like not even a problem anymore. He's not even around. So I don't know how you solve it.
What has Nickelodeon had to say about all of this? Well, they responded saying, quote, "Now that Drake Bell has disclosed his identity as a plaintiff in the 2004 case, we are dismayed and saddened to learn of the trauma he has endured, and we commend and support the strength required to come forward." Drake later called the response, quote, "pretty empty," and he pointed out that Nickelodeon doesn't pay residuals to their child actors, even though they still play reruns to this day, and they also didn't pay for any of his therapy after the fact. Nickelodeon also recently stated that it, quote, "investigates all formal complaints as part of our commitment to fostering a safe and professional workplace. We have adopted numerous safeguards over the years to help ensure we are living up to our own high standards and the expectations of our audience." Another pretty empty statement.
Yeah, sounds like a lie. They're just covering their ass. Like, no, we investigate all formal complaints. Well, and maybe now they do. Who knows? But damage is done at this rate.
Yeah, which is, so, I mean, there's my daughter's favorite show right now is Blue's Clues.
Oh God, that was my favorite show as a little kid.
Such a great show.
That was about the same age when I really got into it too. That was like my favorite one.
Which is kind of funny because she's like the only little kid that we know that's really into Blue's Clues. Like all the other kids are into Bluey or some of the Paw Patrol, some of the other ones, but she just loves Blue's Clues.
Yeah,
and that's a Nick Jr. Show.
Yeah,
I pray there's nothing dark behind that show in any way.
If anything, I mean, the good part about that show, when I was watching it, it's just the actor on a green screen.
Yeah,
so there's no interaction with
right.
children or anything on there.
Other than Josh, who's now the star of the show, interacts with Joe, and Steve. They make guest appearances.
Oh, that's sick. I'm glad
on it.
Steve's
Yeah,
back.
yeah. Steve still
I
comes
love
in.
Steve. He seems like a really cool dude.
Well, he posted on Instagram after this docuseries came out. I was like, this is a safe space for anybody who wants to talk. Like he like came out and obviously was like, this is horrible, and I'm here if anybody wants to just vent or talk about it. And
Steve is the man.
He is the man. Love Steve. Yeah, the Blue's Clues movie. My daughter loves. Yeah, there's a Blue's Clues movie that came out.
I might have to go back, start watching Blue's Clues again.
It's an amazing show. But it's just after all this came out, I'm like, God, like, is there more going on that we don't know about?
I know. I just kind of assume, I said at the top of the episode, don't meet your heroes. It's kind of just assume everyone is just human and you really don't know who they are at the end of the day. And just because they're on screen doesn't really mean much. Which right after I said like Steve's the man,
right?
Maybe I would take that back because who knows? But I don't know.
It's all so hard to digest and come to terms with, really.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing really shocks me anymore with just where we're at in society, in the world. And I mean, so much of this has been going on for so long that, it's finally starting to surface. And I'm glad that at least we're becoming aware of it as a society and, calling it out for what it is and taking the power back in a way.
Yeah. I also think that there are ways to keep children safe, like Nickelodeon. So, growing up, I was raised in the Catholic church. I went to Catholic school. We know about those, everything that happened with that. That's a huge can of worms.
Yep.
I was also a Boy Scout. And that's an entire other thing with pedophilia, so being a part of like two communities that have had things
rampant
happen
history
like that.
Yeah.
But like even in Scouts, it's like, here's what you can do to protect children. You use the buddy system. You should never be alone with an adult that is not your parent, right? Like there are these rules and you have to sign this handbook when you become a Scout to acknowledge that you understand these rules. And I feel like, why couldn't Nickelodeon kind of implement rules like that? You're never alone with an adult. You always have your parent present at this. Like, why aren't there more strict rules? Why aren't there more strict laws in this industry to just make sure that these children are really never isolated with a potential predator, or adults in general? Like, I feel like it should just be mandatory. Always have their parent around or a guardian around or another child actor around. I feel like there are plenty of ways to mitigate these problems, but.
Well, even with Mr. Handy, like how the hell did he make it onto set?
Yeah.
How did, like,
no
clearly the hiring process at Nickelodeon was non-existent.
Yeah.
For a long time. And
I think their excuse was that it was like, oh, this is kind of a freelancer. He wasn't like technically Nickelodeon stuff or some bullshit like that. Like, but they tried to cover their ass with that.
Why wouldn't you just take those few extra steps to ensure the safety of everyone?
Yeah.
On the production. I mean, and I think to your point too, I think there was maybe some of that of like, because I remember from the docuseries, a lot of the parents were like, "Oh, I was always around." And,
and Joe Bell
things were happening in front of us sometimes, and nothing was being done. So even with safeguards in place, doesn't equal safety, right? Because they're not enforcing those things because they have a show to make, and where are they going to start just like canning people left and right, and then the show doesn't go on, and then the bottom line is impacted. And I think the other tricky part too is that, specifically with Brian Peck, he's doing things outside of work.
Right.
He's having
come over
these inappropriate relations personally outside of the workplace. So it's like, can Nickelodeon do anything about that? Could they have stopped that in some way? I don't know, because he was doing things outside of Nickelodeon's bubble, so to speak. So that's what's difficult. And I think it just comes down to they've got to take complaints, especially from parents, seriously and actually do something about it, even if that means it's going to impact the production of the show, or you have to find a new production assistant or a new dialogue coach for an actor. Like, it's just very, very clear that it's always been about the money. It's always been about getting things done on time and at the expense of those most vulnerable. And that stems into the music industry. I mean,
Yeah.
things that are happening with Diddy and, this, talk about a whole other can of worms. I mean, it's like this is a systemic issue across all industries, all facets of society. And it's a much larger issue than just what happened at Nickelodeon. I mean, it's like what's going on and what can we do as human beings on this earth to protect one another? And I think I just don't know that there's an answer to that, because there's such a power divide, there's such a divide between those at the top and those, the everyday person. And I think oftentimes we feel powerless and feel like, what can we do about this? The government won't do anything. They put these guys away for a few years. They come back out, they reoffend, and it just goes on and on and on. The cycle of abuse continues. And it's like, what? I don't know.
We have no answers.
I'm just like spiraling right now.
I know.
I'm like,
it's hard not to.
What do we even do? I mean, it's such, I am, as a father now, it's changed my, it's just made me so much more conscious and aware of things. And I'm thankful this is what I get to dive into, as hard as it is to dive into this stuff and to hear about these horrific things that happen to other people. And it kills me. It's like, I feel like I have a leg up on a lot of people, because a lot of people just don't know about these things, and that these things happen, or that there's these types of predators out there. And so, but it just has made me, I'm just like, I have to be so,
I know it's hard. It's also hard. It's also hard not to get extremely paranoid.
Right. Exactly.
It's like, who is, it's like, it feels like it's everywhere, I don't know. I have no
It
answers.
extends to sports, the gym,
God,
NASA, and it just goes, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
This issue, especially with,
and Sandusky too. Is that his name? Jerry Sandusky? Yeah. So you're right. It's everywhere. Good God.
It's like, you just can't trust your children with anybody, is really what it comes down to. I mean, even and most abuse even happens by one's own family members.
True.
And that's what the hardest thing is. Like, even your own family members, this could happen. And it's like, as a parent, you're like, how can I truly protect my child from all of these dangers out there? I mean, it's just.
Yeah. And even with Larry Nassar, like, some of the parents were in the room when it was going on. They just didn't really understand what was happening. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to put yourself in their position and know exactly how you would be. I mean, I feel like in my mind, I would, if I ever saw anything, I'd be, all over it and shutting it down before hopefully it gets to the point of no return. But, it's so hard.
This is one of those episodes. So it's, we just need a Matrix reset button. Yeah, this is a depressing one with no solid answers too. I don't know where this, something needs to topple and reset here.
On so many levels.
Yeah.
I mean, it just goes on and on and on. There is another episode coming out though, on April 7th. So this Sunday, you're seeing this episode on Friday. Check that out though. We definitely will be on, Investigation Discovery as well on Max. I'm curious to see what this will be about.
Yeah, because is it an afterthought or did they find more stuff? I'm definitely going to be tuning in.
Or maybe it's just covering like the aftermath of the docuseries coming out.
Yeah,
kind of wrapping it up. Or is there more from Drake?
Right.
That we haven't heard yet. So definitely we'll be checking that out, and definitely want to hear your thoughts on this one. And
I kind of want to hear Danny's thoughts.
Yeah.
Final thoughts. Danny, anything?
I mean, you guys have pretty much covered a lot of it. There's not really much left to say on such a deep, intertwined, and extensive issue that I'm sure has been going on for hundreds of years at this point. I fear that no amount of legislation is really going to stop the issue, because people will always find a way to get what they want, no matter how devious it is. And I know there exists a union for child actors. I don't know if it's called a union, but I know there's groups that help support the young actors. I think we just need more of that, and we need more of a vetting process in these industries, and we need more rules and regulations and anything we can to protect these children, because as it's kind of been proven over the course of this episode, is that the laws don't care about kids, and that's something that needs to change.
No, because the ones that make the law
are pedophiles.
It's just like, oh my God.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's hard not to have a tinfoil hat sometimes.
Yeah. Is this even tinfoil hat?
No,
at this rate?
I don't think it is. I think it's proven fact at this point.
Yeah.
Which then makes you
Paranoid.
go farther down the tinfoil hat path, where I get it. I get why people go down that route, because you're like, if this is going on, then does this seem that ridiculous? And does this seem that ridiculous? And it's just like, I mean, you can, it's a dark, dark hole you can go down. And when at the end of the day, we all just want to live our lives, be happy and healthy, and, you know, give our kids a better life than we had, is what we're all after. And sometimes it feels like an impossible task. It really does.
I'm going to go watch some dog videos and like cleanse the brain a little bit after this one.
If I just like disappear one day, it's because I moved to the middle of nowhere with my family and live off grid. If I just disappear,
threw your cell phone into a river.
And I just never have internet connection again. Because sometimes, some days I feel that way. I'm like, would it just be better to leave society behind and just go homestead? And be free of all this? Because it's just, and you know, my kid is going to eventually be exposed to a lot of this stuff. No matter how much I try to shield them from it, they're going to learn about it. They're going to hear it from other people, and it's just I'm dreading the conversations I'm going to have with her in the future.
Well, if it's any consolation, growing up in the environments that I did, where you would kind of expect things, Catholic school, Catholic church, being, you know, with priests during all that, and also, you know, being a part of scouting in environments that were known to harbor sexual predators, I was very lucky that, I mean, I didn't have any experiences like that. So if that maybe eases your mind about it, where I don't know, maybe it doesn't, but I don't know.
Keep her out of the Catholic Church. Keep her out of Girl Scouts. Got it. No, I know what you're saying though. It's because, I mean, I can't just like keep her from living her life, right? She's got to be able to. That wouldn't be fair to her. But I certainly will keep a watchful eye over her and her communication, especially, you know, while she's a minor, for sure. That's really all we have on this one. I mean, I think there was definitely some things that we kind of talked about that go beyond what was covered in the docuseries, and and just some of the connections among other people tied to Bryan Peck. But I think he should still be in prison. I think, like we saw with other people we mentioned in this, that there's always the fear of that person reoffending. And that's what is scary to me, is that one day there'll be another news break of Bryan doing something. But hopefully not. But you just never know. So we're going to leave you there. Let us know your thoughts, of course. And we'll see you guys next week. And until then, lights out, everybody.